Hi, God, this is really terrifying, and poor Greg, the sound guy up there, has just heard me deploying every swear word under the sun for the last 10 minutes, so sorry, Greg. Thanks very much for having me. My name's Amy, and I'm going to talk to you today about some principles for writing inclusive documentation and how we've applied those principles in our team. So I have to be honest with you. One of the reasons that I agreed to do this talk today, it wasn't because I was drunk when Chris asked me to do it, although that did play a part. But it's because, if you hadn't noticed, this event is happening in October, which gave me the irresistible opportunity to call this talk, unofficially at least, Doctoberfest. Oh, come on, it's not going to get better than that, if I'm honest. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's downhill from here. So yeah, there's nothing that I love more than a bit of tenuous wordplay, but let's start with a bit of background. So I work at the Government Digital Service, or GDS, and for those of you who haven't heard of GDS, it's part of the Cabinet Office, and it's probably best known for building and maintaining gov.uk, which is the website that hosts information about the UK government and guidance for citizens. Right now, if you go to gov.uk, you will also see a lot of these big red arrows, which are taking you to information about how to prepare for Brexit. So, yeah, just to say up front, I'm absolutely not going to be covering Brexit today, and no comment. But yeah, gov.uk also brings government services together in one place. And that's things like how to tax a vehicle, or register to vote, apply for a UK passport, and report treasure. So yeah, just all of the standard stuff, really. So I've worked at GDS for 3 years now, and before that I worked at the UK consumer charity Which. I spent 6 years at Which, and I worked across a pretty broad range of content areas. I worked on energy companies and legal services, lawnmowers, spiralizers, Christmas puddings, and compost. And by way of proof, this is a nice natural shot of me, just casually hanging out with a bag of compost in my back garden for a news story for the June 2015 edition of Which Gardening. And that was actually just one of many moments that I spent in front of the camera there. I can't believe I'm about to do this. But yeah, in fact, if you happen to be sort of going around the advice guides on which.co.uk, then you'll see me making various appearances. So this is me explaining how to buy the best pressure washer and the best hedge trimmer. And this is me in my Oscar-winning performance as Woman Who Cannot Choose a Hairdryer. Or presenting the first look review of the Upper Baby Vista pushchair. So a fun fact for you, this isn't actually an empty pushchair. There's actually a plastic doll in there. And I've spent more hours of my life, than I care to say, pushing that thing around bloody Regent's Park. So imagine the sort of experience of people coming over just to look at what they think is going to be a real human baby, and then just seeing this kind of sinister, lifeless face staring back at them. I did actually try and fail to get you a picture of the doll, but they've actually upgraded it to something which is a bit less creepy. But if you just imagine something along these lines, that's woke you up, hasn't it? I just heard someone in the audience go, Jesus Christ. Sorry, I promise I've not lost it. So in 2017, I left Which, leaving behind all the glamour of show business, to come and work at GDS, which brings us back to gov.uk, where my love of documentation began. So before gov.uk, there were hundreds of government websites, all with different identities, and it was often really hard to know if you were actually on a government website or not. So fast forward to 2012, GDS launched gov.uk as the single website for UK government services and information. So it's got a clear, consistent identity, which means that when you travel through different parts of gov.uk, it looks and works in a way that's recognisable and familiar and easy to use. And maintaining this visual and functional identity is really important, but it is challenging too, because although gov.uk looks like one website, it's actually designed and delivered by hundreds of different service teams. And they come from 25 different ministerial departments and various arm's-length bodies. And those teams are based all around the country, and they're all working independently at the same time, and often to tight budgets and deadlines. So our big challenge is how do we help all of those teams to efficiently deliver usable, accessible services that kind of look and feel distinctly like gov.uk, when the reality behind the scenes is probably more like this, with parts of the same service sometimes being delivered by different government departments. And one of the ways that we're helping to solve this problem is with the product that my team and I built. So this is it. It's called the Gov.uk Design System, and it's publicly available, so you can go and see it right now. It's at gov.uk/design-system. And there's currently 10 of us working on it. So we've got 2 interaction designers, then there's a content designer, a tech writer, 3 front-end developers, a user researcher, a product manager, and a delivery manager. This is what we all look like. This is up a couple of weeks ago. I think it's fair to say there was mixed feelings about the impromptu photo shoot in a lift. I think particularly I refer you to Mark, our tech writer in the top right there, who is absolutely hating his life and wondering what he did to deserve this experience. So yeah, this is the core design system team, and we work on the design system day to day. But it's worth saying that the design system is also built on the work of many contributors, past and present, from across government, not just GDS. So the real team shot probably looks a bit more like this. Some of you might see your own faces on here. And yeah, actually, in reality, a much bigger version of this and a more up-to-date one. So the Gov.uk Design System is where we document design guidelines and common solutions to start with when you're designing or building government services. It contains the core styles for things like colours, typography, lists and links, and it also contains common user interface elements. So that's things like form inputs, buttons, error messages, warnings, and so on. And it includes guidance on best practice for common tasks and page types, so maybe things like how you ask a user for their name or how you'd help them create an account. So just to be clear, documenting these conventions in a design system is not something that GDS invented. There's lots of design systems out there, and there's more being created all the time. So in fact, let's just have a quick show of hands. How many people have a design system in their organisation? The real problem with this is I actually can't see you very well at all. So I think that was quite a few hands though. And how many of you work on one? Stick your hands back up if you work on one. So there's a few of you, okay. Yeah, so design systems are pretty kind of run-of-the-mill, and they do get talked about a lot at these kinds of events. But what's not talked about so much just yet is the role of content design when it comes to design systems. And that's what I want to cover today. So I guess I should just say a quick word about what content design is, just to make sure that we're all on the same page about that. So at the most fundamental level, content design is just about using content in the smartest way to help achieve an outcome. It helps people to get what they need using the most appropriate format, even if that format is not written words. Content design is driven by user needs, communicating what people actually need to know and not what we as an organisation might want to tell them. And it's evidence-based, so it's using research and data to understand users' behaviour and deliver what they actually need. So lots of design system teams that I talk to don't have a content designer. Just stick your hand up again if you work on a design system team. Okay, and keep your hand up if there's a content designer on your team. Okay, a few, so yeah, okay. So it is getting better, but I think that content designers are still seen as a bit of a nice to have on design system teams, and I'd like for that to change. So, as is the case for any product, a design system's content is the single biggest factor in helping people to find it, use it, and contribute to it. And without proper content design, it's so much harder to make these things possible. So to start with, let's talk about what content design means in the context of design systems, because it covers quite a broad range of things. So it includes all of the documentation and introductory content that tells people what it is that they're looking at and why it exists and how to use it. So that's things like the content on your homepage, information on how to get support, and contribution guidelines. And then there's the content elements of component examples, so things like the text that you use on a button or the label used on a form input, and things like hint text, error messages, and warnings. And it might include technical documentation, so installation guides or information on how you migrate from an older code base or legacy system if you've got one. And it also covers content design best practice. This is where it gets a bit meta. So like things like an organization's tone of voice and a content style guide and content design patterns to solve common content problems, the way that we use design patterns to solve design problems. And it even includes content about the system, so presentations and blog posts or template answers that your team might use to respond to common user questions and external stakeholder queries. And of course, it also includes component guidelines. So this is the documentation that tells you how to use the things in it. And that includes how they're organized and named, how to show examples, and the guidance which explains how to use them. And that's what I'm going to focus on here. And the reason that I want to focus on that is because when we don't get it right, that's when we leave the door open for the web design equivalent of this to happen. So design systems are essentially providing people with tools and parts that are intended to be used in a certain way. And yes, things will always need to be adapted to context, like we'll need to make changes based on what user research tells us, but there is a limit to that. So this chair, for example, cannot be sat on anymore. Its component parts have been misused beyond their tolerance for adaptation. And when we provide people with tools and parts, but not instructions that explain how to use them, we're setting ourselves up for failure from the very beginning. So it's really important that we document things properly. So we follow 10 design principles in government, and number 7 is understand context. And as with any content, documentation of components and patterns needs to be context specific, so it needs to do this. And although design systems in general exist to solve largely similar problems, there isn't really a one-size-fits-all solution to documentation because it has to be context-specific. So good documentation will be designed in a way that supports your organization's specific needs and goals and values and challenges. And as I've touched on, the biggest challenge that we're facing with gov.uk design system is that government is absolutely massive. So our documentation needs to cater to literally hundreds of service teams, all working in different locations. And one of the things that means is that we cannot make people use it. So even if we could figure out a way to police that many teams to make sure they're using our patterns, we probably wouldn't be very popular for it. So if we can't force people to use it, and we don't really want to do that anyway, we have to get them to choose it. So we have to make it easier and more appealing to use the gov.uk design system and the components and patterns it contains than not to. And that starts with good documentation. And then, because our audience is so vast, we also know that there's massive variation when it comes to our users' job roles and their context and the environments in which they're working, their years of experience and their confidence levels. And the reality is that we'll never even meet most of our users. So we need to think about how we can make our documentation inclusive and relevant for a really broad audience, not just developers and not just people with lots of experience. So in the year leading up to the design system's launch, and since then, we have carried out lots of user research with hundreds of users, and we've tried to find out sort of what it is that what they need from documentation and what that would look like in practice. And in the end, we found that it boils down to 4 main principles. So good, inclusive documentation needs to be clear, consistent, useful, and honest. So let's start with clear. So the gov.uk design system is used by everyone, from the most seasoned practitioners down to those who are just starting out their careers. So we can't write our guidance for experts. Using very technical language and industry jargon probably works okay for some of our users, but we know that it alienates many more. And I'd say that's true for anyone with an ambition to grow their organisation and sustain their design system over time. So if we want the design system to be used as widely as possible across government, which we do, then we have to use clear, inclusive language. And that starts with how we sort and name things in the design system. So we've done an awful lot of research to get our naming conventions and our categories right. And we've researched with over 300 users. We started with the card sort in our first sprint. Then we did a tree test to try out our first pass and see if that was working. And then we've done multiple rounds of research and iteration since then. We're still working on it to find out sort of how users think about these things and where they would expect to find them. And yeah, at the end of that, it left us in a position to be able to really, really confidently conclude that no one agrees on bloody anything. So yeah, I mean, this is a problem, but there's actually a good reason for it. As I've highlighted, our industry really likes making design systems. We're making more of them all the time, and we already have loads of them, but we've never really been able to settle upon a consistent approach to sorting and naming the things within them. And that influences the way that people think about them. So in terms of grouping things in design systems, some teams define things in their design systems as design tokens, as established by the brilliant Gina Ann in the Salesforce design system. Other people follow something called Brad Frost's atomic model, which categorizes things as in size order, as atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages. Oh, what happened there? Hopefully that's not going to happen again. That'd be a disaster. So then, yeah, and then other people class everything as design patterns. Some people call things components, while other people call the same things elements. And that's just to do with the actual sorting and naming of categories. When we actually get down to the things themselves, that's when it gets really interesting. So this thing, as an example, this is some clickable text. And when a user clicks on it, it expands to reveal some additional content. So HTML calls this a details tag, but lots of people in day-to-day conversation that we find call it progressive disclosure. And our product manager, Tim, who is genuinely one of the cleverest people that I've ever met, he's head of interaction design at GDS and very much an adult man, calls it a showy hidey thing. He's quite proud of this. Yeah, and actually when I gave this talk a couple of months ago, Tim was in the audience, so I was able to make him stand up and be ridiculed in front of everyone. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it today, but I didn't want him to feel left out, so I just made this. So that's Tim, and that's his Twitter handle. And do feel free to just tweet him a little snap of this. I'd really like it if we could just flood his mentions with mockery. So. Yeah, well, then there's this thing. So this was designed by a team working on the passport office who needed a way to interrupt their users' flow to give them some important information about their application. So it relies on using a contrasting visual style to slow people down and to make them pay extra attention to the content. So I'm going to ask out, has anyone got any ideas what they would call this? Just shout. I mean, someone's got to do it. Yeah, this happened last time. I can't hear you. I think that's probably correct, though. Someone else? Anyone? Jeez, you think I would learn. Anyone else? Anyone near at the front, perhaps, with a loud voice? Interruption card. Wait, yeah, brilliant. So, so we showed this to a room full of 80 designers last year, and we asked them to come up with some naming ideas for it. And we gave them 5 minutes. And in 5 minutes, they came up with 186 different names, and that's so that's duplicates have been removed. And so we had some pretty sensible suggestions like interruption card or call-out box or alert page. And then we also had some more interesting suggestions like knowledge bomb and blue screens of wisdom. And then we had seriously, read this page. And this one, which baffles me because I can only assume it was suggested by someone who's never encountered menstrual products, because all I see when I look at it is a tampon, and I just can't unsee it. And then we had a handful of just really literal suggestions, like instructions about things people need to know but will definitely skip thinking they don't panel. So yeah, that's probably a little on the long side. So all of this is to say that there is not really one mental model of how things should be grouped and named in design systems. So making the approach that we've chosen clear to our users, it's really important, and it's also really hard. But that's where user research comes in. So although our research didn't point to a sort of fundamentally right way to do things, we did learn some stuff that helped. So most people, although there is definitely some variation in the terms that they used, that we spoke to, sort of could conceive of things like typography, colours, spacing, and layout as a distinct collection of things. And we call these things styles. And we also started to see a trend in terms of how people would talk about certain things in the design system compared with others. So some things were talked about like objects. So they're distinct, they have a shape, they can be manipulated, copied and moved, and they're made out of stuff, in this instance code. And they don't necessarily have a context on their own, but they're designed to be used like building blocks, so you can take them and use them in a range of different contexts. So we've defined these as components. And then other things were talked about more like behaviors or repeatable ways of doing things. So these are repeatable steps that you carry out when you need to complete a known action in a specific context, like asking users for their name or helping them to create an account. And these are what we've defined as patterns. So we've been able to sort out everything that our system needs fairly easily into styles, components, and patterns. But it is worth remembering that this is just where we've drawn the lines. It's not consistent across the board by any means, and those lines will not be immediately clear to all of our users. So we've done a few things to try and help with that. So we've created landing pages for each section describing what it contains and how we've defined them. And then we've also established a naming convention that reinforces that split that I mentioned earlier between components and patterns. So because people tended to think of components like objects, we use nouns to name them, like accordion, backlink, breadcrumb, button, and so on. And we use the common HTML names wherever we can so that we're not adding new names into the mix. And then for patterns, which are more like ways of doing things, we use verbs to name them as far as we can. So things like ask users for addresses or help users to check that a service is suitable. And we use plain English descriptive names for these so that we give new users the best possible chance of finding what it is that they need. And we've also built aliases into our search. So this lets users search for things using the name that they know for them without creating barriers to findability. So, using this kind of gives them a gentle nudge towards what we've called it. And finally, I think it's worth saying that the bottom line is if you can't get consensus, which you often won't be able to, then the best thing to make things clear to your users is to just be consistent. So, as luck would have it, consistency is actually our second principle for good documentation. It's like I planned it that way. So consistency is really important for helping users to trust a product and find their way around it. And I've talked about consistency in terms of how we group and name things, but we also extend consistency to our usage guidance. We have a team style guide which records conventions for design system-specific terms and contexts. So it's just internal, and it means that we can make sure that we're describing things consistently throughout our documentation. And this is especially important when we're explaining any technical concepts because some of our users might not have heard of them before, and explaining things in lots of different ways makes it much harder for people to remember them. So we try to be as consistent as possible to reduce that burden. And having a style guide also means that we can be really consistent in how we write our content in a way that reflects our core values. Like how we always refer to ourselves in the third person as the GovUK design system team. And that's because, as I touched on earlier, there's a whole community of contributors involved in creating the design system, many of whom are outside of our team and work in different departments. So we don't want to create a false sense of us and everyone else. And that's a really important message for us. Contribution is a massive part of the GovUK design system's success. It's what makes it representative and responsive to user needs. So we need to make sure that we're being consistent about this in a way that kind of hammers that message home. And then we also try to be consistent in terms of how we structure guidance. So all of our component and pattern documentation in the design system follows a fixed content structure, which covers an overview, sections on when and when not to use it, how it works, and where possible, we also document the research behind a component. Using the same content structure to document all components and patterns helps users navigate the design system. And if things are documented and named in the same format, users can start to predict that format, which means they can get more quickly to the thing that they need. And because our design system lets people outside of our team contribute to it, using a consistent structure for our documentation helps contributors understand what information they need to provide. So for this reason, our content structure is publicly available as part of our contribution docs. And this makes using a fixed format for our guidance just as useful for contributors as it is for users of the system. And maximising the usefulness of docs is next on my list. So, as I said earlier, we don't force people to use the GovUK design system, so we really can't afford to take up their time with content that isn't truly useful. Good documentation isn't about documenting absolutely everything, contrary to slightly popular belief. It's about delivering content that's relevant for the right user at the right time and in the right channels. For full disclosure, I stole that from a mug, which was designed by Phil Hogg and Tori Dunn, who also work in government. But this is really key. We have to be scrupulous about our docs because every single line of content that they contain represents one more thing that our users have to think about and do. It's why I spend a lot of my time as a content designer deleting more content than I'm actually producing. Because as much as we might care about our documentation, our users just aren't turning up to appreciate our clever IA or our carefully crafted component guidelines. They're just trying to do a job. So when we're writing documentation, everything that we say must be useful and have a clear purpose or an action that a user can take after reading it. And how we show examples is a good example of this. So, as far as possible, we use live examples in the design system instead of screenshots. And that lets us show not just how components look, but how they should behave. So we can show things like how they flex to different screen sizes and what focus states look like and how they handle things like autocomplete or spell check. And we also use real content in the design system wherever we can. So if something's been designed for a specific context, like a pattern for asking users for their date of birth, our example copy can show how to phrase the question and how to write a hint and how to label the inputs. And you just don't get that if you're using lorem ipsum or any other kind of placeholder copy. And our examples are provided with code. So that means that users can quickly try them out by pasting them into their project or their application and see what they look like in context. And by building examples like this, we're going beyond just providing users with a visual, and we're making them work as hard as they possibly can to be useful. So our examples are actually doing 5 jobs at once. They're showing what a component or pattern should look like, how it behaves, including focus and error states, what label, hint, and error copy to use, how to code it correctly, including any accessibility requirements that might not be visible from the example at a first glance. And we're also providing code for people to take if they need to. So we're giving users everything that they need to understand a component, decide if they need to use it, and the means to use it in one place. So, yeah, okay, I'm going to level with you here and say that I don't have a good section, a good sort of segue into the next bit of this talk. Oh, someone's taking a photo of this. That's not going to look good, is it? Without the, yeah. But so, yeah, I tried my best, but there's just nothing, I could do. But luckily, the next section of this talk is about our final principle for good documentation, which just so happens to be honesty. Come on. Thank you so much. So it's easy to assume that documentation needs to provide all the answers, but if there are gaps in our knowledge, which there will be sometimes, or if there's known issues with the thing that we've built, it's much more helpful for our users if we're honest about them. So one of the government design principles is make things open, it makes things better. We've even stuck it on stickers just to show how serious we are about it. And in the design system, being open and honest about gaps in our components and patterns is the first step to filling them. Sharing mistakes and failings makes it much less likely that other people will repeat them. And it also means that we don't have to wait until something is perfect before it can be published. One way that we do this is to label components and patterns that need more research as experimental. So we include information about what we still need to write out in the research section of our docs. As an example, our accordion component is experimental at the moment because it needs more research. Because although the plus and minus icons on the right-hand side there are widely used across government services as accordion controls, we're concerned that some users, particularly people using screen magnifiers, might not see them. And we don't actually know if this is a problem. We haven't seen it, and we don't really know how to fix it if it is. But we've documented this in our research section as a known gap in our knowledge because being honest about this gives our users some control, and it means that they can keep an eye on it in user research. If they do spot a problem, they can tell us about it, and with any luck, they can contribute a fix. There's a help improve this page section at the bottom of every component and pattern page in the design system with links to the page's markdown file where they can suggest an edit and to our community backlog where they can ask questions or share feedback. And in this way, components and patterns are improved over time with input from our community of users, most of whom work much more directly with users of government services than we do. And this is where I want to finish up today, because ultimately everything that we're doing comes back to people. So the documentation that we write for professional users impacts how our products and services get built. And those products and services in turn affect people and their lived experiences. And that's where documentation comes in. So written documentation lets us guide good practice in a way that code and examples alone just can't. Like in our pattern for asking users for telephone numbers, our documentation lets us remind people that not everyone has or can use a phone. So you need to give them a choice about how they can be contacted. Or in our asking users for names pattern, we can explain that some people's names are really long and they contain numbers and symbols, and not everybody's name fits into a neat first name, last name format. We shouldn't restrict name fields based on false assumptions about what a real name should look like. And then there's the documentation for our error messages component, which reminds us that not everyone can understand or even see an error in a form. So error messages need to be specific and clear, and they need to make sense on their own out of context. And this kind of documentation is really important. Because this broken chair metaphor isn't so funny when the thing that you've broken is someone's ability to use your service or identify themselves correctly. And that's why documentation is so important, and it's why it's our responsibility to make sure that we do it right. Cheers.
That went well.
It was all right, wasn't it? Didn't swear too much. I don't really know if I swore.
I was busy laughing, sat down.
Wait, okay.
So there's been quite a few questions.
Okay.
I'll try and get through as many as I can, but we've got 2 minutes. By the way, I wasn't just doing some weird lunge there. I was actually looking at the clock on the laptop. That'd be awkward. How do you best manage teams that really don't embrace the GovUK design system or claim to struggle with resources and time to even look at the design system?
Yeah, we try to understand them, I suppose, is step one. We are doing some research at the moment about barriers to adoption of the GovUK design system. It's definitely a thing. I think we don't assume bad intent if we can help it, because it is frustrating sometimes, but we recognise that people are dealing with lots of constraints within their department and they can't necessarily adopt it. So our job is to understand what those barriers are and try and reduce them. Our user researcher, Rosie, is actually here today and she's leading on that research. So I'm sure she'd be very happy to talk to you more about that after the talks.
Well, what's the process for rolling out changes to existing design patterns across GovUK?
So it depends on the scale of the changes. We try to keep our system as stable as possible. We try not to do breaking changes to the code very often because we recognise that that's a barrier to adoption. In terms of kind of guidance changes or design changes, we have a multidisciplinary, multi-department working group who assures new components and patterns and significant changes for us. So by running it past them and making sure that it's going to work within their departments, we can kind of make sure that those changes are fair and representative and that they're going to meet user needs and they're not going to ruin anyone's life.
Okay. And what would you say is your own personal greatest accomplishment in the work that you do on the design system?
Jesus, I don't know. I think, probably should say content design only takes up around 50% of my time. The other part of my time is spent doing lots of work kind of on the community-facing side. So I do a lot of work to help people contribute to the design system. I facilitate those working group review sessions that I mentioned. And I think a lot about our kind of contribution model and how we can get more people feeding their work into it. And probably that, to be fair, I think that that's the most important part of what we do.
Brilliant, thank you. Huge round of applause for Amy Hupe.
Should I unplug this?